I didn't realize I was destroying my own peace until one simple sentence made everything go quiet in a way I had never felt before. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the kind that usually passes without meaning. When the house felt too still and the ticking clock on the wall sounded louder than it should, and I was sitting in my living room, staring at nothing and yet thinking about everything at once, replaying old conversations, imagining future problems that hadn't even happened, rewriting words I wished I had said 10 years ago, and then arguing with people who weren't even in the room anymore. My mind moving so fast it felt like I couldn't catch up with it. And that's when my son Daniel looked at me from across the couch and said, almost casually, "Mom, do you ever stop thinking?" And I laughed, because it sounded like a strange question, but the truth was, I didn't know how to answer it, because the thinking never stopped. Not in the morning when I made coffee, not in the afternoon when the sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor, not even at night when the world outside went quiet and the rest of the neighborhood fell asleep. My mind would keep going, one thought leading to another, one worry feeding the next, like a loop I didn't remember choosing, and I had lived with it for so long that I thought it was just who I was, a person who thought too much, someone who needed to analyze everything, prepare for everything, remember everything, as if thinking harder could somehow protect me from life itself. But sitting there in that moment, with Daniel's words hanging in the air, I felt something shift, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, uncomfortable awareness, like a light turning on in a room I hadn't entered before. And for the first time, I noticed the noise, not the kind you hear with your ears, but the kind that fills every quiet space, the kind that doesn't let you rest even when nothing is wrong. And I realized I couldn't remember the last time I had truly felt still, truly felt present, without a second voice inside my head commenting, questioning, correcting, worrying. And it made me wonder, not with panic, but with a slow, creeping curiosity. What if the problem wasn't the world around me? What if it wasn't the past I kept replaying or the future I kept predicting? What if the problem was something much closer, something I had mistaken for myself all these years? Because the more I paid attention, the clearer it became that the thoughts weren't helping me. They weren't solving anything. They were just repeating, recycling, reshaping the same fears and memories in different forms. And I sat there quietly, hands resting in my lap, feeling the weight of that realization settle in, not heavy like a burden, but steady like something true. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't rush to fill the silence. I didn't reach for another thought to distract myself. I just noticed what was already there. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint sound of a car passing outside, the softness of the evening light fading into dusk, and underneath all of that, something else. Something I had overlooked for years, a kind of space, a quiet that wasn't empty, but full, waiting patiently beneath all the noise. And I found myself asking a question I had never asked before, not out loud, but somewhere deeper, almost like a whisper to myself. What if I didn't have to follow every thought that came into my mind? What if I could just stop? That night, I went to bed earlier than usual, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to escape the noise. Yet the moment I turned off the lamp and the room slipped into darkness, the thoughts returned exactly as they always did, lining up one after another as if they had been waiting for this moment all day, reminding me of things I had forgotten to do, conversations I wished I had handled differently, possibilities that had not even happened but somehow felt urgent. And I lay there staring at the ceiling, noticing something I had never really paid attention to before, how quickly one thought would trigger another, how a simple memory could spiral into a chain of worries that stretched far beyond reality. And instead of getting lost in it like I usually did, I paused, just slightly, and watched it happen, as if I were sitting on the edge of a river observing the current instead of being pulled into it. And it felt strange, unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, because I had spent so many years identifying with every thought that came into my mind that stepping back from it felt like stepping away from a part of myself. But I stayed there, quietly, not fighting it, not trying to fix anything, just noticing. And for the first time I saw the pattern clearly, the repetition, the way the same worries wore different faces but carried the same weight, the same tone, the same restless energy. And I realized that none of it was actually happening in the room with me. The room was still, the air was calm, nothing was wrong, and yet inside my mind there was constant movement, constant noise, and that contrast made something inside me shift again, deeper this time, because it became harder to believe that all of this thinking was necessary, harder to convince myself that it was protecting me, when all it seemed to be doing was exhausting me. And I turned onto my side, listening to the faint hum of the heater, feeling the softness of the blanket against my hands, grounding myself in something real, something present, and each time a thought tried to pull me away, I noticed it, gently, without chasing it, without arguing with it, just letting it pass the way you might notice a car driving by on a quiet street. And it did not stop immediately. The mind did not suddenly become silent, but there were small gaps, brief moments where nothing came next, where the usual stream of thoughts hesitated, and in those moments there was a kind of stillness that felt different from anything I had experienced before, not empty, not lonely, but steady, almost peaceful, and I began to understand, not with words but with a quiet certainty, that the silence had always been there, underneath everything, waiting, patient, unchanged, and it was not something I needed to create or force, it was something I needed to notice, and as that realization settled in, my body felt a little lighter, my breathing slowed without effort, and for the first time in a long while, I did not feel the need to solve anything before falling asleep. I did not feel the pressure to think my way into peace, and as I lay there in the quiet, I saw more clearly than ever that the thoughts would come and go on their own, just like they always had, but maybe, just maybe, I did not have to follow them every time the next morning arrived quietly, the way mornings always do, with a soft gray light slipping through the curtains and settling across the floor, and for a few seconds, before my mind had the chance to catch up, there was nothing, no noise, no urgency, just a simple awareness of being awake, and it felt unfamiliar in a way that made me pause. Because usually the thoughts would begin immediately, a list of things to worry about, to remember, to prepare for, but this time there was a delay, a small window of stillness that I noticed before anything else could take its place, and I lay there without moving, almost afraid that if I shifted too quickly I would lose it. And then, just as expected, the thoughts started to return, slowly at first, then faster, like a familiar routine picking up where it had left off. But something about it felt different now, not because the thoughts had changed. They were the same as always, but because I was seeing them more clearly, as if there was a slight distance between me and them, a space that had not been there before, and instead of getting pulled into the first worry that appeared, I watched it form, noticed how it tried to expand, to connect itself to other worries, and for the first time I did not immediately follow. I just observed, quietly, almost curiously, and it passed. Not completely, not permanently, but enough for me to realize that it was possible, that I did not have to go along with every direction my mind suggested. And I sat up slowly, placing my feet on the floor, feeling the cool surface beneath my toes, grounding myself in something simple, something real, and as I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of coffee, I paid attention to each small movement, the sound of the kettle, the warmth of the mug in my hands, the faint aroma rising with the steam, and each time a thought tried to interrupt, I noticed it without resistance, letting it drift past instead of holding on to it. And there were moments when I forgot, when I slipped back into the old pattern and found myself replaying something from years ago, or imagining a conversation that might never happen. But even then, there was a new awareness, a quiet recognition that I had been pulled in again, and instead of judging myself or trying to force it away, I simply stepped back, returning to the present moment as gently as I could. And this rhythm continued throughout the morning, a back and forth between awareness and distraction, between stillness and noise. And it made me realize how automatic it had all been before, how easily I had believed that every thought required my attention, how naturally I had followed them without question, and now, seeing it more clearly, it felt almost like watching a habit unfold in real time, something learned, something repeated, something that did not define me as much as I once believed. And as the hours passed, I noticed small changes, subtle but undeniable. The way my shoulders felt a little less tense, the way my breathing came a little easier, the way the silence between thoughts, even if brief, carried a sense of relief that I had not known I was missing. And standing there by the kitchen window, looking out at the quiet street, I understood something that had been hidden in plain sight for so long. that the peace I had been searching for was never something I needed to build or earn or chase. It had always been there, steady and unchanged, beneath the constant movement of my mind, waiting for me to notice it, waiting for me to stop long enough to see that I was never truly as trapped in my thoughts as I had believed. Later that afternoon, I found myself sitting in the same chair by the window, the one I had passed by countless times without ever really noticing, and the sunlight had shifted, stretching longer across the floor, warming the edge of the rug beneath my feet, and everything around me felt ordinary, unchanged, the same quiet neighborhood, the same distant sound of a car rolling by, the same ticking clock on the wall. And yet there was something different in the way I was experiencing it, something subtle but steady, as if I were finally present in a moment that had always been there waiting for me. And I realized how often I had missed this, how many afternoons had slipped by while I was somewhere else entirely, lost in thoughts about yesterday or tomorrow, replaying conversations that could not be changed or preparing for situations that might never come. And as I sat there, I noticed the familiar pull again, a thought forming at the edge of my awareness, trying to draw me into its story, something small at first, a reminder about a bill, then quickly expanding into a chain of what-ifs. What if I forget? What if something goes wrong? What if I am not prepared? And I saw it clearly this time, not as a truth, not as something I needed to solve immediately, but as a pattern, a habit that had been repeating itself for years without question. And instead of following it, I stayed where I was, feeling the warmth of the sunlight, the steady rhythm of my breathing, and I let the thought be there without giving it anything more, without feeding it with more attention, and slowly, almost quietly, it lost its hold, fading the way a sound fades when you stop listening to it. And that moment stayed with me, because it showed me something I had never fully understood before, that the thoughts only seemed powerful when I followed them, when I believed they required my involvement, and without that, they did not disappear completely, but they no longer controlled where my attention went. And this understanding did not arrive all at once. It unfolded gently, through small moments like this, moments where I chose, even if only for a few seconds, to remain present instead of being carried away. And I began to see how much of my life had been shaped by this unconscious habit, how many decisions, how many emotions, how many sleepless nights had been influenced by thoughts that I had never questioned. And it was not a feeling of regret that came with this realization, but something quieter, something closer to clarity, because I could see now that nothing had been taken from me, nothing had been broken. It was simply that I had been looking in the wrong place for peace, searching through thoughts for something that could only be found in their absence. And as the afternoon continued, I allowed myself to sit with that understanding without trying to turn it into something else, without trying to explain it or analyze it further. And each time my mind tried to return to its old patterns, I noticed it, not with frustration, not with resistance, but with a kind of patience that I had never offered myself before. And little by little, I began to trust that this quiet space was not something fragile that could be lost easily, but something constant, something that remained even when the thoughts returned. And for the first time, I felt that I did not need to escape my mind or control it or fix it. I only needed to see it clearly, to recognize what it was and what it was not. And in that recognition, there was a kind of freedom that did not come from changing anything on the outside, but from finally understanding what had been happening inside all along. As the evening settled in, I noticed something else I had never truly seen before, not in all the years I had spent living inside my own thoughts. The way the mind would try to return to control the moment the day began to slow down, as if it could not tolerate stillness for too long. And I was standing in the kitchen, rinsing a cup under warm water, when it happened again. A familiar voice inside my head began to list things I should be concerned about, small things at first, then larger ones, responsibilities, uncertainties, memories that carried a quiet weight. And for a moment, I felt the old pull, that instinct to engage, to follow, to solve. But instead of stepping into it, I paused, not dramatically, not forcefully, just a small hesitation. And in that hesitation I saw something clearly, something that had always been there but hidden beneath habit, that the mind was not asking for my attention. It was assuming it, moving forward as if I would follow without question. And that realization shifted something again, because it meant I had a choice, not a complicated one, not something I needed to figure out, just a simple awareness of whether I would go along with it or not. And I stood there, feeling the warmth of the water against my hands, noticing the sound of it running, the quiet hum of the house around me. And I allowed the thoughts to continue without participating, without adding to them, without resisting them either, just letting them unfold on their own. And slowly, they began to lose their urgency, their insistence softening into something less demanding. And I understood then that the mind was not an enemy, not something that needed to be silenced or controlled. It was simply active, conditioned, repeating patterns it had learned over time. And the more I watched it without reacting, the more obvious it became that its power had never been in the thoughts themselves, but in my habit of believing them, of following them as if they were instructions instead of passing suggestions. And that understanding did not come with a sense of struggle. It came with a quiet kind of relief, as if something that had felt heavy for so long was no longer pressing against me in the same way. And I moved through the rest of the evening with that awareness gently present, not forcing it, not trying to hold on to it, just returning to it whenever I noticed I had drifted. And there were moments when the old patterns returned more strongly, when I found myself caught again in a loop of thinking before I even realized it. But even then, the difference was clear, because now there was recognition, a moment where I could see it happening. And that moment was enough to step back, enough to remind me that I did not have to stay there. And as I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I felt a quiet certainty forming, not something I needed to explain or prove, but something I could sense with a calm clarity. That peace was not something waiting at the end of solving every thought. It was already here, in the spaces where I chose not to follow them. And for the first time, that idea did not feel distant or impossible. It felt real, something I could return to again and again, not by changing my life or controlling my mind, but simply by seeing clearly what had been happening all along and choosing, in each small moment, where to place my attention the next day. I made a quiet decision, not something dramatic or announced, just a simple intention that formed as naturally as breathing, that I would give myself 10 minutes, nothing more, nothing complicated, just 10 minutes where I would not follow a single thought. And I did not know exactly how it would work, or if it would work at all, but something inside me felt ready to try. And I chose the same chair by the window, the one that had slowly become familiar in a different way, and I sat down, placing my hands gently in my lap, feeling the weight of them, the warmth of my own skin, and I closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to notice, and almost immediately, the mind responded, as if it had been waiting for this challenge, thoughts appearing faster than before, louder, more persistent, reminding me of things I should be doing, things I might forget, questions that seemed urgent, and for a brief second, I felt the old instinct rise, that need to engage, to answer, to follow, but instead, I stayed where I was, noticing the urge without acting on it. And it felt uncomfortable at first, like resisting a habit that had been repeated for years, like stepping out of a familiar rhythm that once felt natural, and the thoughts did not stop, they circled, repeated, changed form, trying different ways to pull me in. And I watched it all, not perfectly, not without slipping, but with a growing awareness that each thought was separate from me, that it arrived, stayed for a moment, and then passed, even if I did nothing at all. And slowly, something began to change, not in the thoughts themselves, but in the space around them, the way they seemed to appear within a larger quiet that I had not fully noticed before. And I shifted my attention gently to my breathing, not controlling it, just feeling it, the air moving in, the air moving out, the subtle rise and fall of my chest. And each time a thought interrupted, I noticed it, then returned, not with frustration, not with effort, just with a simple redirection. And there were moments when the mind felt restless, almost impatient, as if it did not understand why I was no longer participating in its constant activity. And then, without warning, there were brief pauses, small gaps where no thought followed the last one, and in those gaps there was something different, something quiet and steady, not empty, but full in a way that did not need explanation. And I remained there, allowing those moments to expand naturally, without trying to hold on to them, without turning them into something else. And for the first time, I experienced what it felt like to simply be present without the need to think about it, without the need to label it or understand it. And as the 10 minutes passed, I realized something that felt both simple and profound. That silence was not something I had to create by force. It was something that revealed itself when I stopped interfering, when I stopped feeding every thought with attention, and when I finally opened my eyes. The room looked exactly the same as before. Nothing had changed on the outside, and yet everything felt slightly different, softer, clearer, as if I had stepped out of a constant background noise I had grown so used to that I no longer noticed it. And I sat there for a moment longer, not rushing to move, not rushing to think, just noticing the quiet that remained, and understanding, not through words but through experience, that this was always available to me, not as something distant or difficult, but as something immediate, something that existed. In every moment I chose to see it, the following days unfolded with a quiet consistency that I had never experienced before, not because everything suddenly became easy, but because I began to see the process more clearly, the subtle dance between awareness and distraction repeating itself in small, ordinary moments, and I noticed how quickly the mind would return to its familiar patterns, especially when I was not paying attention, when I was washing dishes, folding laundry, or simply sitting. Without anything to do, the thoughts would slip in, quietly at first, then gathering momentum, trying to recreate the same loops I had followed for years, and sometimes I would catch it immediately, recognizing the shift, feeling the moment where I was about to be pulled in, and I would pause, just enough to step back, to let the thought pass without engaging. And in those moments, there was a sense of clarity that felt steady and grounded. But other times, I would not notice right away. I would find myself already deep in a chain of thinking, replaying something from the past or imagining something in the future, and it would take a few seconds, sometimes longer, before I became aware of it again. And in the past, that would have frustrated me. It would have felt like failure, like I was doing something wrong. But now, there was a different response, a softer one, where the moment of noticing itself felt important, as if each time I became aware, no matter how late, I was stepping out of the pattern again, and that changed everything, because it meant there was no need to be perfect, no need to stop every thought or control the mind completely, only the need to see clearly what was happening and return, again and again, to that quiet space beneath it all, and I began to trust that process, not as a technique I had to master, but as something natural, something that unfolded on its own when I stopped interfering. And one afternoon, as I sat once more by the window, the light softer now, the day settling into a calm stillness, I realized that the silence I had touched before was no longer something rare or accidental. It appeared more easily now, not because the thoughts had disappeared, but because I was no longer following them with the same intensity, and there were longer moments where nothing needed to be solved, nothing needed to be figured out, just a simple presence, a quiet awareness of the moment as it was, and it felt steady, not fragile, not something that would vanish if I moved or spoke, but something that remained quietly in the background, even as life continued around it. And I understood then that this was not about escaping the mind or fighting against it. It was about seeing it clearly enough that it no longer controlled me in the same way, and that understanding brought a kind of ease that I had not known before, not excitement, not a sudden transformation, but a calm, steady shift, like a weight that had been there for so long that I forgot it could be lifted. And now, even when the thoughts returned, even when they became loud or persistent, there was a space between them and me, a space where I could choose not to follow. And that space, simple as it was, felt like something I could trust, something that did not depend on circumstances or outcomes, something that was always there, waiting quietly for me to notice it again. One quiet morning, without planning it, I found myself sitting by the window again, not because I had decided to practice or improve anything, but simply because it felt natural to be there, and the air in the room carried that same gentle stillness I had begun to recognize, not something new, but something I had overlooked for most of my life. And as I sat down, I noticed there was no urgency in me to control what would happen next, no need to make the moment meaningful or productive, just a quiet willingness to be present. And the thoughts came, as they always did, but now they felt different, not in their content, but in their presence, like distant sounds instead of commands, like something passing by rather than something I had to engage with. And I watched them without effort, without resistance, noticing how they appeared and disappeared on their own, how they did not need me to push them away or solve them. And there was a softness in that realization, a kind of ease that settled into my body without me trying to create it. And as I continued to sit there, something else became clear, something deeper than anything I had understood before, that the silence I had been touching in brief moments was not something that came and went. It was always there, constant, unchanged, and the thoughts, no matter how many or how loud they seemed, were simply moving within it, like ripples on the surface of something much larger and much more still. And I felt that stillness more fully now, not as an idea, but as something directly experienced, something I could rest in without effort, and it did not require me to stop thinking completely. It did not demand perfection or control. It only asked that I see clearly what was happening, that I recognize the difference between the movement of the mind and the quiet awareness beneath it. And as that understanding settled in, there was a subtle shift, almost like stepping out of a room I had been living in for years without realizing it. And everything felt more open, more spacious, even though nothing around me had changed, and I noticed how simple things appeared. More vivid, the way the light moved across the wall, the faint sound of wind outside, the gentle rhythm of my own breathing, and none of it needed to be analyzed or understood. It was enough to simply notice it, to be with it. And in that simplicity, there was a kind of peace that did not depend on circumstances, that did not come and go based on what was happening in my life. And I realized that this was what I had been searching for all along, not in the future, not in solving problems or organizing thoughts, but right here, in the quiet space that had always been available. And for the first time, it felt natural to trust it, not as something fragile or temporary, but as something steady, something I could return to again and again, without effort, simply by noticing what was already here. And as I sat there, no longer trying to change anything, no longer trying to improve or control my experience, I understood that nothing had been missing all those years, nothing had been broken or lost. It was only that I had been looking in the wrong place, following the noise instead of noticing the silence that had been there all along. As the days continued to unfold, I noticed that nothing about my life on the outside had changed in any dramatic way. The same routines remained, the same quiet mornings, the same simple meals, the same familiar streets beyond my window. And yet everything felt different in a way that was difficult to explain but impossible to ignore, because the weight that had once followed me through every moment was no longer there in the same way. And it was not that my mind had become silent forever. Thoughts still appeared just as they always had, sometimes calm, sometimes restless, sometimes persistent, but they no longer carried the same authority. They no longer felt like something I had to obey or resolve. And I began to see more clearly that the freedom I had been searching for was not found in controlling the mind or eliminating thoughts, but in understanding that they were never in control to begin with, that their power had always come from my habit of following them without question. And now, with that habit slowly loosening, there was a sense of space in my experience that allowed everything to be as it was without overwhelming me. And I moved through each day with a quieter attention, noticing small details that had once gone unseen, the way the morning light shifted across the table, the gentle sound of leaves moving outside, the feeling of warm water against my hands as I washed dishes. And none of these moments needed to be turned into something more. None of them needed to be analyzed or improved. They were enough as they were. And that simplicity brought a kind of ease that I had not known for most of my life. And there were still times when the old patterns returned more strongly, when I found myself caught in thinking before I realized it. But even then, there was no urgency, no sense of being trapped, because I could see it happening. I could recognize the moment I had been pulled in, and that recognition itself was enough to step back again, to return to that quiet awareness that had always been there beneath everything. And this became less of a practice and more of a natural way of being, not something I had to remember to do, but something that revealed itself whenever I paid attention. And I understood now that peace was never something I needed to create or achieve. It was not waiting somewhere in the future. After all problems had been solved, it was already present in the space between thoughts, in the moments where I chose not to follow the noise. And that understanding settled in gently, without effort, without the need to hold on to it, because it was not something that could be lost. It was something that remained, steady and unchanged, regardless of what passed through my mind. And as I sat once more by the window, Looking out at the quiet street, I felt a simple clarity that did not need words, a knowing that the search I had carried for so long had come to an end not because I had found something new, but because I had finally seen what had been there all along, waiting patiently beneath every thought I had ever followed.